So far in this course on social welfare and social legislation, you have been introduced to the Constitution of India, to the fundamental rights, and a few other things. It's about time that you are exposed to the set of positive rights which are granted under the Constitution of India. These are called the Directive Principles of State Policy. They are enumerated in Part 4 of the Constitution of India. I have called the Directive Principles of State Policy rights, but they are not rights in the strictest sense of the term. No citizen can approach a court and ask it to give directives that his rights under the Directive Principles of State Policy be implemented. You might then ask, what is the point of merely writing lines in the Constitution if the same cannot be implemented? That is a valid question. But the question then which you must then ask is, does the state have the resources to do all that it wants to do? Can the state be compelled to do those things which it might not have the capacity to do? And that is exactly what the Directive Principles of State Policy are. The Directive Principles of State Policy are such principles which the state must strive to achieve. However, at the time of the framing of the Constitution makers were very aware that it might not be possible for the state to implement these principles right away. Therefore, it was made incumbent upon the state, upon the government, to ensure that these directive principles are sought to be achieved. However, there was no time limit set upon it. It was not required that the government must achieve these directive principles in a certain stated amount of time. You might still ask, it still seems somewhat shaky. You might still say that what is the point of having such statements which have no applicability, having such statements which have no force of law? After all, fundamental rights might be negatively worded, they might be providing minimum guarantees, but at least there are some guarantees. Directive principles do not do anything of that sort. What would be the point of that? The answer is very simple. The directive principles of state policy are not enforced by any ruling of a court. The directive principles of state policy are implemented by the wish and will of the people. It was thought that any government which seeks to implement these would automatically generate the goodwill of people and therefore would be re-elected to power. The votes will swing in favor of those people who finally make these directive principles applicable. It was not the courts which were going to be the enforcers of directive principles, but the people's will itself. Thus, as you can see, the directive principles are notionally a higher level of rights, a higher level of principles than the fundamental rights, because they are not negative admonitions to the state. Rather, they are positive call to action to the state. The following excerpt would enable you to grasp the meaning of directive principles of state policy better. The makers of our Constitution knew that independent India was going to face many challenges. Foremost amongst these was the challenge to bring about equality and well-being of all citizens. They also thought that certain policy direction was required for handling these problems. At the same time, the Constitution did not want future governments to be bound by certain policy decisions. Therefore, some guidelines were incorporated in the Constitution, but they were not made legally enforceable. This means that if a government did not implement a particular guideline, we cannot go to the court asking the court to instruct the government to implement that policy. Thus, these guidelines are non-justiciable, that is, parts of the Constitution that cannot be enforced by the judiciary. Those who framed our Constitution thought that the moral force behind these guidelines would ensure that the government would take them seriously. Besides, they expected that the people would also hold the governments responsible for implementing these directives. So, a separate list of policy guidelines is included in the Constitution. The list of these guidelines is called the Directive Principles of State Policy. Now let me give you a very interesting example here. There are certain countries in the world which have an extensive lineup of fundamental rights. An example of that is the recently framed Constitution of Nepal. However, it is not only impossible to implement those rights, it is also perilous because it puts the government in a situation wherein it is always failing in the eyes of the people. It also fails to understand that there are certain minimum requisites and then there are aspirations. It is those minimum requisites which need to be fulfilled before one moves towards the aspirations. Therefore, we can see the great wisdom of the founding fathers of Indian democracy in understanding that there are some rights which are immediately required and there are some policies which must be followed in the times to come, but any government may not be saddled with them, or it might be premature to do the same. The founding fathers were desirous of providing not merely a police state, but a state which cares for the welfare of its residents. Thus, they included a non-justiciable set of objectives in Part 4 of the Constitution, from Articles 37 to 51. These are called the Directive Principles of State Policy. This idea of having a non-justiciable aspirational set of goals was borrowed from the Constitution of Irish Republic. The first question, as we have already discussed, which would emerge in your mind is, if the Constitution makers indeed cared so much for the directive principles, why did they not make it enforceable like the other parts of the Constitution? The answer lies in the great blend of idealism and pragmatism that marked the functioning of the Constituent Assembly. The Constitution makers were not merely bent upon great principles, but they also wanted to make sure that they make a constitution that can be implemented properly. They were aware of the fact that India was just coming out of the foreign yoke, and the country's limited resources made it necessary that some aspirations be made operational and some kept for the times to come. Another interesting facet of directive principles is that they are positive obligations of the state, as I have been stating, and unlike fundamental rights, they need active participation and dynamism from the state. This participation and dynamism may not always be possible due to economic and other constraints. Thus, the directive principles are not justiciable in a court of law. This means that no government may be compelled by a court decree to enforce any particular directive principle. However, mere lack of compulsion to implement should not be taken to mean the lack of motivation to implement. The Constitution makers believed that the moral force behind the directives would compel the government to implement the same. Now, since we are dealing with a course on social welfare, we need to ask ourselves, do these directive principles talk about social welfare? Do these directive principles in any way relate to the welfare activities of the government? The answer would have to be a loud and resounding yes. As a matter of fact, it is the Directive Principles of State Policy which contains some of the more important provisions regarding the welfare of the largest section of the population. While the fundamental rights provide a minimum guarantee, the Directive Principles ask and call upon the government to rise up and provide the needy, the desirous, and all such who require any assistance, that assistance which will make their life worth living and which will enable them to rise up to the aspirations of the Constitution of India and of the Republic of India and of the world. Let us look at a classification of directive principles of state policy to improve our understanding of them. The classification of directive principles is necessary to develop a proper understanding of them. However, you must remember that this enumeration is not mentioned in the Constitution. It is not a legally stated enumeration. This is an enumeration which we are making to make it easy for us to comprehend and understand the scheme of directive principles. The classification of directive principles is usually done along three axes. These are, first, the Gandhian principles, second, the social and economic principles, and third, the miscellaneous principles. Let's look at these principles in detail. Firstly, the Gandhian principles. Mahatma Gandhi's impact on the freedom struggle can only be understated. There are few people who have impacted India's course as a country as Mahatma Gandhi. However, he was not merely a political leader. His impact on Indian society was far and wide, and his thoughts continue to imbue India with a certain fragrance. His understanding of the needs and aspirations of the Indian masses was unparalleled, and many of his objectives for the betterment of the Indian society were included in the directive principles of state policy. You must remember that the Constituent Assembly itself was composed of the stalwarts of the Indian freedom struggle. The Constituent Assembly's legitimacy largely drew from the sacrifices made by these people while they struggled for the independence of India. Most of these people believed in the Gandhian principles, and even those who did not believe in Gandhi believed in the correctness of the ways of Gandhi. Following this, many principles of the Gandhian thought process were included in the directive principles. Now let me enumerate some of these principles to you. The first of those principles is the directive to organize village panchayats. Mahatma Gandhi was very aware of there existing a method of conflict resolution and development within the villages themselves called the village panchayat. He sought to let Indian villages be self-sufficient and let them be not dependent on outside agencies as far as possible. Therefore, he sought to establish the village panchayats. As you all know, this Panchayati Raj system has been effectuated in India since 1991. Its merits and demerits apart, the Panchayati Raj system is indeed about including the last person in the growth and welfare of India. The Panchayati Raj system derives itself from Gandhian principles, but you must remember that Panchayat per se is an institution of much greater antiquity than the Gandhian movement itself. The panchayats existed in castes. Panchayat basically means elders sitting together and deciding the problems faced by the community. The second directive principle is to promote self-employment through cottage industries to rural areas. I do not need to point to you that the constructive work of the Gandhian movement for independence was a very important part of his attempt to bring the largest number of Indians into the Indian mainstream, economically and politically. For this, he thought that machines did not have much of a space in India, and even if they did, they were only there to supplement and not to supplant the human labor. Therefore, he promoted self-employment through cottage industries. This would also be an answer to unending and unnecessary excessive urbanization. He therefore promoted self-employment through cottage industries, which would rely on traditional knowledge and which would produce things which would be required by the people of villages and towns overall. The third Gandhian principle is to bring about reduction in the usage of intoxicating drinks and drugs that are injurious to health. This particular principle again draws on a Gandhian principle. This principle has often been utilized by many state governments across India to ban alcohol, and other drugs have also been banned. Another principle which derives from Gandhian philosophy is to reserve and improve the breeds of cattle and prohibit slaughter of cows, calves and other milch and draught animals. This principle again draws from Gandhi's belief that India resides in its villages, and cattle are important for the continued economic well-being of these areas. This principle has often been utilized by many states to ban the killing of cows. This has often been also opposed on the grounds of being a means of implementing religious views as opposed to actual economic views. While that remains a moot point, we must understand that this is a directive principle which seeks to improve the breed of cattle and prohibit slaughter of cows, calves and other milch and draught animals. Other than the Gandhian principles, most of the directive principles fall in the category of social and economic principles. It would be worth our while to enumerate these principles. One of the principles is the state shall seek to direct its policy to secure adequate means of livelihood for all the citizens of India. Since the Indian social movement was vastly influenced by the socialist thought process, this directive principles find a place amongst the directive principles of state policy. We do need to remember that at the time of independence, India was coming out of extreme poverty. We also need to remember that even today, in absolute terms, India contains the largest number of poor people in the world, more than even sub-Saharan Africa. This is a situation which needs to be addressed, and maybe the best way to address it would be to provide adequate means of livelihood for all the citizens of India. Then another directive is the natural resources of the nation are to be so distributed that common good is served by them. This principle seeks to do away with concentration of resources in few hands to the detriment of others. This again at some level derives from the socialist thought process. The economic system should not operate in a manner which results in concentration of wealth and means of production to the common detriment. Another principle is equal pay for equal work to both men and women. Another principle is the health and strength of workers, men and women, and the tender age of children are not to be abused. Another principle is children should be given opportunities and facilities to develop in a healthy manner and in a condition of freedom and dignity. Another principle is the citizens are not forced by economic necessity enter a vocation unsuited to their age and strength. Thus we see most of these provisions are actually welfare measures which are sought to be implemented by the government. However, it would also become very clear to you that it might not be possible to implement them through a court decree. It would always depend on the ability and the resources of the government to bring them into action. There are other directive principles such as to make effective provisions for securing the right to work, education and public assistance in case of unemployment, old age, sickness and disablement, and in other cases of undeserved want. As you can very clearly see, this directive principles has been sought to be implemented through the currently existing National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Those people who have no other means of earning their livelihood can go and demand work as a matter of right, and for 100 days in a year they will be provided a certain sum of money which is indexed to the inflation indicia of the nation. Therefore, we see that governments actually attempt to ensure that these directive principles are followed. Another directive principle is to make provisions for securing just and human conditions of work and for maternity relief. Then there is to provide living wage etc. for working sections. Another principle is to take steps to secure the participation of workers in the management of undertakings. Then there is the principle that the state must strive to promote education and economic interests of working sections of the people, especially the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. This directive works in conjunction with the special protection given to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes under Part 3 of the Constitution. There are some miscellaneous provisions which derive from various other sources and find a place in the directive principles. These are other than the Gandhian and socio-economic principles. These include to secure for all Indians a uniform civil code, to take steps to secure the separation of the judiciary from the executive of the state, to raise the standard of nutrition and health, to organize agriculture and animal husbandry on modern scientific lines, to protect historical monuments, to promote international peace and security, to maintain just and honorable relations between nations, to foster respect for international law and treaty obligations, and to encourage settlement of international disputes by mutual agreement. Let us now look at the issue of implementation of directive principles. A multiplicity of steps are taken to lay the foundation of the sort of society the directive principles of state policy envision. To begin with, land reforms have been introduced, leading to the abolition of zamindari and such other systems of inequity. With better distribution of land, greater and more equitable leaps in the production have been made. This has been accompanied by land ceiling legislations, putting a limit on the maximum amount of land a person can hold. Major nationalization drives were undertaken by the governments of large banking, aviation and other such industries. Now we shall take a look at the individual directive principles in a greater depth, specifically pertaining to the issues relating to our course on social welfare and legislation. Child labour. As mentioned above, one of the directive principles states that children should be given opportunities to develop in a healthy environment. In the previous chapter, you were introduced to the right against exploitation and also right to equality. It must now be clear to you that the directive regarding children is the dynamic facet of the right to equality and right against exploitation as far as they relate to children. Employment of children under the age of 14 is prohibited by law in industries which may cause hazards to children's health. The spirit of this directive has been sought to be implemented through a variety of legislations. We will take a broader look at those in the chapters to come. There will be multiple chapters which will deal with children's issues, children's needs, legislations pertaining to children. However, it must be remembered that India is also a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of Child. This convention seeks to protect children all over the world against exploitation, neglect and abuse. This convention makes it incumbent upon the signatories to establish minimum standards of child protection. Another body implementing this directive is the National Human Rights Commission. Ministry of Health and Family Welfare also seeks to achieve the objectives set out by this directive. In spite of this multiplicity of institutions, India's record in child rights is pathetic, to say the least. The reasons behind this are multiple. Firstly, there is a lack of proper educational opportunities. Secondly, there is a skewed opportunity structure per se. And thirdly, there is a lack of family support, particularly in the case of children from the poorer backgrounds. Women and Indian society. Directive principles as well as fundamental rights place stress on the need for special protection to women and special programs for their upliftment. While many milestones have been achieved on this path, much still needs to be done. The fundamental duties also stress upon the need to renounce practices derogatory to the dignity of women. A plethora of laws and judicial pronouncements have sought to provide dignity to women. However, it is well known to all that the inherent patriarchal bias in much of Indian society still results in abysmal sex ratios and gruesome practices such as dowry harassment and bride burning. To empower women further and improve their life chances, 1/3 seats have been reserved in panchayats and municipalities for women members. Further, a bill seeking to reserve 1/3 seats in the legislative bodies is also pending in the Lok Sabha, having been passed by the Rajya Sabha already. We would take a look at greater detail in later chapters at the social welfare measures intended for the benefit of women. We have mostly seen the more important of the directive principles, and we have looked specifically at the child welfare and women welfare aspects of those. Now, towards the end of this lecture, I would like to introduce you to a very important issue in Indian constitutional law, which has great bearing on directive principles. The question is, what is the interrelationship between the fundamental rights and the directive principles of state policy? This question has been raised again and again in Indian courts of law. Let me make it easier for you to understand what I am trying to say. The directive principles are positive obligations. Can a government ask individuals to refrain from exercising their fundamental rights because it is implementing a particular directive principle of state policy or a number of them? To give you an example, let's assume you have a right to freedom of speech, and one of the directive principles state that children should be allowed to live in a state of freedom, in a state of dignity. Can the government pass a legislation that any picture which says any word which might make a child feel insecure may not be presented in any public theatres in India? While this example is somewhat loose, but this would give you an idea how the directive principles and fundamental rights might often come in conflict. In the beginning, the Indian judiciary took this issue and said that no, the fundamental rights may not be violated in any instance whatsoever, even when the directive principles are sought to be implemented. This interpretation of the directive principles and fundamental rights lasted for some time. However, around the 1970s, the courts took a more proactive approach, and they decided that the implementation of directive principles of state policy is the primary government duty, and therefore, when the state seeks to prevent anyone from exercising their fundamental rights on the grounds of implementing directive principles, the same may not be questioned in a court of law. To implement this even more, some governments sought to amend the constitution, saying that anything done to implement the directive principles of state policy may not be questioned in a court of law for violation of fundamental rights. However, later on, the jurisprudence developed in such a manner which saw fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy as necessarily existing together, none being superior to another. Thus, what is sought now is a coexistence, an equilibrium between the two, so that none is sacrificed for the other. After this discussion, one hopes that you have gotten an understanding of the nature of directive principles of state policy, the reason of their existence in the Indian constitutional scheme, and most importantly, their true nature and the functions they serve. After having understood this, and after also knowing the fundamental rights, you are sufficiently capable of going through the coming lectures on the social welfare and social legislations in India, as you now have an understanding of the constitutional basis of much of it.